It gives me great pleasure to introduce the distinguished Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of the New York Times, Mr. Thomas L. Friedman. Tom, it's great to have you with us.
Lynn, great to be with you.
So let me start with a topic you've written a lot about, which is the age of accelerations. And of course, accelerations are accelerating and they're continuing, and these are bringing new forces to bear. And so I just wondered what you think about the way the age of accelerations is evolving and how it will affect us.
So as I see the world today, Lynn, I think the biggest thing happening is the world's not just changing, it's being reshaped. And it's being reshaped by three giant accelerations. One is the acceleration in technology, which just keeps accelerating. And when you get acceleration on top of acceleration, you get an incredibly fast-paced world. Second is the acceleration in globalization. The world's getting knitted together by all of these technologies, farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And at the same time is acceleration in climate change and environmental degradation. And that's also going on at the same time. They're all what I call the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law. They're just on these three giant accelerating curves. Now, what these three accelerations are doing is say, reshaping the world in four fundamental ways. It's making the world fast, incredibly fast pace of change. It's making the world fused. And we're not just interconnected now. We're not just interdependent. We're fused with each other. And it's making the world deep, in that technologies are now going so deep into us that we suddenly decided we needed to add the adjective deep to everything. Deep mind, deep research, deep medicine, deep fake. No. That's not just fake. That's deep fake, okay? Because it's going deep to places that were science fiction to us just 5 years ago. And lastly, it's making the world incredibly open. Because as these technologies accelerate, as the world gets this more fused, everyone today can be a paparazzi, a filmmaker, an editor, and a publisher just using this thing. It's making the world incredibly open for people to participate, collaborate with each other, but also put out their own truth. And their own version of events. And such an open world where so many people are now publishers and editors and filmmakers and paparazzi can become very difficult to govern. And what this is doing is creating a situation where all the old ways in which we govern the world in terms of binary relationships, left versus right, government versus people, government versus companies, regulation from government, innovation from companies, education, work, work, retire. All these binaries that had governed our lives, I would argue, are collapsing. And the only way to actually govern this world is through ecosystem relationships. So that's why all these political parties around the world, in my view, are actually blowing up, because you can no longer govern the world on this kind of left-right grid. You actually need collaborative ecosystems in all these different areas to get the most out of this world and to cushion the worst. And I think that's why we're struggling so much at the political level now. So political parties are either collapsing or falling back on really tribal identity formulations, not so much policy ones, because they are not actually matched anymore to the world as it is. So that's just kind of a broad introduction.
Thank you. You talked so much about, we've written so much about globalization, and now we see things like shortening supply chains and nationalism and splintering of the internet. And how do you see that affecting the broad nature of the globalization, the world is flat that you've written about?
Well, there's no question that I would argue the central engine of globalization over the last 40 years was the US-China relationship. I mean, that was the big driver of it, you know. over those 40 years, America and China really became one country, two systems in many ways. And uh, and certainly the breakdown in U.S.-China relations has affected our broader perceptions of globalization. At the same time, I am a technological determinist in this sense. I believe if people have a cell phone that for zero marginal cost can enable me to have collaborators all over the world, investors from all over the world, partners from all over the world, employees from all over the world, and customers from all over the world, and suppliers from all over the world, I'm going to use this phone. So I don't really care what's going on at the national political level. So that's why the world's actually getting flatter at the same time as it's getting more fragmented. It's not that politics can be ignored. I mean, if people are putting up tariff borders, but I always say to people, I am a technological determinist in that if people have technology, they will use it. And the technologies that are being made available to people are actually fusing the world more than ever. Just think of 5G. What people will use it for, whether they will use that technology collaboratively, as we've done more in the last 40 years, or hostilely, that's a whole nother question. But I've learned over the years that I think it's the eight most dangerous words are, I may have the number wrong. The world will never be the same. Okay, 7 most dangerous words. Be very careful. You kind of hit these moments and speed bumps, and again, I take it very seriously. But to me, the meta trend is technology getting faster, deeper, cheaper, more distributed, and more powerful all the time. And that has consequences.
So we particularly have the U.S.-China issue now. How do you see that playing out? I mean, the politics are going to be there. These are still the world's 2 largest economies. It may be that people will change the supply chains by manufacturing Vietnam or something like that instead of China, but people will find ways to interrelate in other ways. So, as you say, the comment "the world will never be the same again" is fraught with peril. But how do you see this adjusting? If you would look 3, 4, 5 years down the road as to how the global economy might be repositioning itself?
Well, I hesitate to look too far down the road. I will simply say this, we're speaking on the morning of October 13th. China just announced its September economic data. It had all-time record highs in exports and imports for a world that's supposed to be fragmenting. I think they're all-time high. Whatever they were soaring record exports and imports. And the renminbi is being turned to now by people as a quasi-reserve currency for stability. So that's in a world where U.S. and China are in a Cold War and fragmenting, and yeah. So always look at the plumbing. What's going on in the plumbing? Not what's going on in the punditocracy. That said, we are ending a 40-year epic, of what I call unconscious integration between the U.S. and China. And during these 40 years, you could wake up in America and say, I want to have a supply chain that starts in China. I want to have a partner in China. I want to have a factory in China. I want my kid to go to school in China. I, George Mason, want to have a campus in China. I want to hire a Chinese scientist or a young techie. On the Chinese side, you could say, I want to study at George Mason. I want to have a factory in America. I want to be listed on the NASDAQ. I want to have American partners. And both sides could really just what I call unconsciously, you don't have to think very much about it. The barriers were pretty low, unconsciously integrate and partner with one another. That period of unconscious coupling is over. How over it is TBD. But it is over. We are now in the process of setting a new framework for U.S.-China relations. Why is that? Well, it's a couple of reasons. One has to do with how China grew over the last 40 years, because China got wealthy. It grew from poverty to middle income by using a number of strategies. The first was really hard work. Second was a lot of delayed gratification. The third was really smart investments in infrastructure. Fourth, really smart investments in education. And all and so real growth, okay, that was on one side. At the same time, part of Chinese strategy was stealing other people's intellectual property, non-reciprocal trade arrangements, and non-compliance with WTO rules. So it's a combination of really hard work and some real cheating. Now, for I'm going to say 35 of the 40 years, a lot of foreign investors, particularly Americans, are actually ready to look the other way at the cheating, because the opportunities to make money by servicing the growth from hard work and smart investments really outweighed the losses from the cheating. That shifted, that balance shifted in the last 5 years. And that's why the business community actually started to turn against China. And that then was reflected in the Trump administration's approach. So there was a change there. And that's on one track. On the second track, what happened was that for 30 of the 40 years, I'm going to say, China sold us shallow goods, goods you wore on your back, on your feet, on your ankles, solar panels you put on your roof. They sold us shallow goods. We sold them deep goods. We sold them software and chips and Boeings, things that went deep into their culture and society. But what happened over the last 5 years is China can now sell us deep goods. That's what Huawei represents, the challenge of Huawei's 5G. But we don't have the shared trust framework to buy China's deep goods. They had to buy our deep goods. We wanted to buy their shallow goods, but we don't have the trust framework to buy their deep goods in an age where everything is becoming dual use. So anything you can conceivably sell China, from a microchip to a hammer, is considered dual use now. And anything they might sell us, 5G, simple 5G, no, with TikTok, oh no, that's dual use, someone can maybe track your kids, karaoke videos on TikTok. And so though that fact that their exports have shifted from shallow to deep has really posed a trust issue in the relationship that we have not overcome. So that's kind of where we are right now. And this is going to have to be worked out, I believe, over the next 5 years. I think if there's a Biden administration, I think there's a chance it can be worked out more amicably, not less, but it will require some real compromises on China's end as well.
You'd mentioned, you've written about moving from e pluribus unum to out of many we. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, America is going through a gigantic demographic shift. By 2040, we'll be somewhere thereabouts. We'll be a minority majority country. And everything you're seeing now, from the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, are really manifestations of the yin and yang, the stresses and strains, the opportunities and the challenges of a country basically moving from a white majority to a minority majority. And by the way, this is happening in Europe as well. It's inevitable, and we have to learn how to embrace it, live with it, and get the best out of it. And in the process, I argue we'll be going from thinking as our motto, as out of many one, that out of this diverse pool, we all kind of meld into that single one defined by a white-led American majority, to, I think, a much deeper form of pluralism, which I call out of many we. We still coalesce, we still come together, but with a deeper recognition and respect for our unique and different attributes that we bring to this, to this single community that we want America to be. And it's a very subtle shift, but I think that's what's happening.
So how would you, what kind of governing structures, you mentioned earlier that the left-right binary are breaking down. What can replace that? What sort of ecosystem governance, whatever might replace that?
Well, I think the most interesting thing happening in the world today, politically, is the emergence of black-green governments. So, hold on one second. So I think the most interesting happening in the world today is the emergence of black-green government. So black-green is a term really coined from German politics, and it describes what are now state government, several state governments around Germany that are combinations of conservatives, CDU, and Greens.
Hmm.
People you never would think would be collaborating before. Look at New Zealand's government. New Zealand's government is the Labour Party, a right-wing anti-immigration party, and Greens. Austria is a center-right party and Greens. Germany has 3 states, I believe, governed by black-green coalitions.
Hmm.
And a lot of people suspect Merkel's long-time grand coalition will be replaced by a black-green coalition. And so I think that's the trend. What does black-green represent? It represents an ecosystem approach to politics, a totally different axis of approaching politics. And because I believe the only way you can govern this world that we're going into, that's so fast, fused, deep, and open, is with coalitions, with ecosystems. The old left-right system, where what we've been oscillating between, is really breaking down everywhere, and you see it all over the industrial world. I mean, what's the Tory party today? I mean, please raise your hand if you know what that thing is. The Labour Party in Britain became a Marxist party. The Liberals disappeared. The Republicans have become a cult of Trump. The Democrats will blow up as soon as they get into power. France is the only country in the world that has a leader with no party and a party and an opposition with no leader. So it's obviously going on everywhere. These 2-party left-right binary approaches to politics that are really a product of the Industrial Revolution will have to give way to a very new politics that will govern the 3rd Promethean moment. Left-right is out of the 2nd Promethean moment. Those terms grew out of the French parliamentary debate with the king over basically rights, after the revolution there, and with the aristocracy sitting on the right and the would-be new claimants to power sitting on the left. That's over. Those do not define the axis of interests, I believe, in today's politics, and that's why all these political parties are blowing up, and they take a while to blow up because they have a lot of resources, and when they no longer represent traditional agendas, they're very hard to kill, so they just morph under the same general headline into tribal parties or identity parties. So they maintain their relevance. I mean, look at the Republicans. They had no platform in their convention. I stop and think about that. What does the Republican Party stand for? They said, we stand for whatever Donald Trump stands for. Okay, they had no platform. Let me repeat that to your audience. The Republicans had a convention and had no platform. Okay, now the Democrats did, but it shows you where all this is going.
You also mentioned some interesting points about how the old industry innovates and government regulates no longer works in the velocity of technological change, and how some of the great educational innovation is taking place in the corporate campuses and things like that. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, you see these binaries breaking down everywhere. So in the old binary system, I government educated through the public school system, and you business employed. But that is breaking down now. We had these knuckleheads out in Hollywood who bribed this guy to get their kids into USC. And I wanted to call those parents and say, excuse me, like, if you're going to bribe somebody to get your kid into a school, could I suggest you bribe to get them into Infosys's online in-house university or IBM's online in-house university? Because if I showed you, Lynn, Infosys's and IBM or AT&T's in-house university, you would say, who do I bribe to get my kid into this? I mean, they're awesome. And they're built not on just in-case learning, going to teach you calculus just in case you need it, but on just-in-time learning. That in a world of rapidly accelerating change, we need to be able to provide you the educational tools to be learning just in time all the new skills you need. So again, the old binary was I went to school and then I worked. Okay, that was a binary. Now it's you basically in those days you learned in order to work, but as one of my teachers, Heather McGowan, likes to say, now you'll work in order to learn. And rather than learn, work, retire. So there was a clear line between learning and working and retiring. Now you will learn, work, learn, work, learn, work, learn, work. So, and to do that, you will need an ecosystem that will be able to provide you just-in-time learning all the way through your career. So the old binary breaks down, and that's why IBM and Infosys and many other companies said to themselves, I can't wait for government to educate. The pace of change is too fast. So I have to therefore innovate, and I have to be in multiple states at the same time. I have to be both educator and innovator. And you see these binaries breaking down everywhere like that.
You've written a lot about communities. And in fact, the basis of our Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities at George Mason is to focus on bottom-up approaches to build local capacity. And also the fact that you have common concepts, typically in community, of dignity and justice and fairness that are not only important to reinforce, but also important to leverage. But how do you scale those local bottom-up initiatives to the national polity, especially one as fragmented as we have today?
Very, not only a good question, Lynn, not only an important question, really the most important question. Because where politics does still work in America is at the community level. And it's the communities that have been able to build ecosystem approaches, where you have basically the business community partnering with the philanthropic community, partnering with the education community, partnering with the social entrepreneurship community, partnering with local government. And they create what I call a complex adaptive coalition. I took that from nature, which ecosystems thrive in nature when the climate changes. Those that build complex adaptive networks, where all the parts of the ecosystem network together to maximize their resilience. So you need to do the same thing in politics. But what you can do at the local level, where people are forced to collaborate, somebody's got to fix the sewers, somebody's got to plow the streets, somebody's got to run the public schools, somebody's got to run the city government. And by the way, we can't run a deficit or print money, so we better figure out how to do this. The fact that it can work at the local level, unfortunately, doesn't translate to the top level. Because what does the local level have? It has what my teacher, Dov Seidman, likes to call trust. Dov likes to say that trust is the only legal performance enhancing drug. Trust is the only legal performance enhancing drug. Where trust is in the room, you can move so fast, you can jump so high. And so how do we get basically trust back at the national level is the central political challenge of American democracy right now, because we have lost both truth and trust at the national level. And without truth or trust, it's impossible to govern.
So as tensions with China grow, coming back to your national piece, how should we be rethinking our relationships with Europe and particularly with Germany?
Yeah, I believe that the Cold War was fought and won in Berlin, and I believe that the post-Cold War competition with China will be fought and won in Berlin. Why is that? Well, Trump's approach to China, so my view about Donald Trump is that he is not the American president America deserved, but he is the American president China deserved. That somebody had to call the game with China, all right? And I think it was very important what Trump did in doing that. It was necessary, but it was not sufficient, because ultimately you don't want to just check China, you want to change China. Now, China is a big country. You do not change China easily. China doesn't change itself easily. And that's a challenge I approach very humbly. Indeed, Lynn, I prefer not even to use the word China. I much prefer to use the word 1/6 of humanity. It gives you a better scale of what we're dealing with. Oh, there's China and there's Zimbabwe. No. There's 1/6 of humanity and, 1/100th of humanity. So we're dealing with a very big enterprise here, and very dynamic for the reasons I cited earlier, and getting more dynamic and more powerful all the time, at least in the near future. And the way you deal with such a dynamic, large economic engine like China seems to me is by building leverage on your side of the table. Negotiating with China without leverage is like playing baseball without a bat. You're not going to get very far. You're really going to hurt your hand after a while, in fact. And so how do you get leverage vis-a-vis China? I believe you first go to TP, you sign TPP, you build the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. You have 40% of global GDP around the Pacific on your side based on American trade rules and interests, with China not a member. Then you take that 40% and you add another roughly 40% by aligning the same way with the European Union. Then you approach the Chinese and you say, look, we now want to talk to you about the global rules of free and fair reciprocal trade, and not just American, interests, whatever. And when you make the struggle with China Trump versus Xi over who can generate the biggest tariffs, we lose. We don't get very far because China can tough us out and it can retaliate in its own ways. And also what you do when you approach a Trump versus Xi is you trigger all the Chinese nationalists on Xi's side. When you make it the world versus China on what are the right and fair universal world rules of trade, then you trigger a lot of Chinese reformers on your side. They don't want to be thought of as outliers from the whole world. From Trump, no problem. Him they can mock and delegitimize, but not when it's the whole world. And so, then you have real leverage. And that's why Trump, I thought, did the right thing in calling the game with China, but he never knew quite where to take it from there. He never really knew how to broaden his leverage to get what he really wanted and what was in our interest.
So let me just address one last question. A large part of our audience will come from the national security community. And we're talking about a future world, future conflict that may look very, very different than what we have been used to in terms of, tanks, planes, ships as being the principal units of exchange versus the minds and mobile devices of the citizens of our engaged countries and things like that. How would you address the members of the national security community in terms of how to think about the way these forces are going to affect in the future the way that they think and they do business, and perhaps they should invest for us?
It's a really good question. F-35s versus Twitter. Let's think about Iran today. Obviously, it's we're using conventional economic sanctions against the regime there to limit their power projections around the region. It's actually working. I wouldn't, it's actually having an effect. I wouldn't diminish some of these old tools. But think about this. What if Donald Trump got up every morning and sent to his 60 million Twitter followers, or how many around the world, hey, Supreme Leader of Iran, which Arab country did you occupy today? How many Muslims did you kill in Syria today? These are kind of new leverage points, which I would argue we haven't used at all, and which he might actually care a lot more about than economic sanctions. When you start to expose him for who he is, openly in the face of his people and fellow Muslims, it can have some very powerful effects. And so I think we have to think about some of these three corner shots, that in a world where every Iranian's carrying a cell phone, and we can get on that phone one way or another directly with our message. Sanctions work, they're important. Those old tools, I don't want to suggest they're not important, but we need to be much more creative about thinking about what actually makes him feel vulnerable, the Supreme Leader of Iran. What makes him feel vulnerable is when you expose him as a fraud in front of his own people and in front of the people in the region. And it's not either or. I'm not saying tanks, planes, and ships don't matter. They do at the end of the day, but they matter mostly in a war, and in between, if you want to have influence, I think it can often be through these very different and new tools.
Tom, thank you very, very much for the time today, and I really appreciate the insights. I'm sure our audience will also. So let me sign off and again express our sincere appreciation. Thank you.
Real pleasure, Lynn. It's always great to be with you.